How did a single fortune cookie at a family dinner end with my son losing the house I gave him, and my granddaughter walking out with me instead of going back inside? I did not yell. I did not fight in the driveway. I used the exact systems they always thought I was too simple to understand. And I waited for the moment when everyone was watching. The restaurant smelled like grease and soy sauce, the kind of place where families go when they want to pretend everything is normal. I arrived 15 minutes early, as always, and watched through the window as my son Porter's Honda pulled into the parking lot. Vanessa emerged first, checking her reflection in the side mirror, smoothing down her blazer like she was heading into a board meeting instead of dinner with family. Owen bounded out next, already talking loudly about something on his phone. Porter came around from the driver's side, looking tired in that particular way that had become his default expression over the past 3 years. Ayla was last. She slid out of the back seat carefully, as if sudden movements might draw unwanted attention. At 9 years old, she had already learned to make herself small. Her backpack was clutched tight against her chest, and she stayed 2 steps behind the group as they walked toward the entrance. Inside, the seating arrangement told its own story. Vanessa directed traffic with subtle gestures and meaningful looks. Owen claimed the spot next to the window, spreading his arms across the back of the booth like he owned the place. Ayla was guided to the far end, pressed against the wall where she could be easily forgotten. Porter sat across from his wife, leaving me the single chair pulled up to the end, close enough to be included, far enough away to remember my place. "Hayes, you're looking well," Vanessa said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted to sound gracious but felt inconvenienced. "How's the warehouse treating you?" "Same as always," I replied, settling into my chair. "Honest work, honest pay." Owen snorted. "Grandpa drives a forklift," he announced to no one in particular, his voice dripping with 13-year-old superiority. "Owen," Porter said mildly, but there was no real correction in it. Just the sound a man makes when he knows he should say something but doesn't want to deal with the consequences of actually meaning it. Vanessa smiled at her son with the kind of indulgent pride that told you everything you needed to know about their household dynamics. "Owen's just excited about his acceptance into the accelerated program at school. Tell Grandpa Hayes about your test scores." As Owen launched into a detailed recitation of his academic achievements, I found myself watching Ayla. She had opened her menu and was staring at it with the kind of intense focus that had nothing to do with choosing between sweet and sour chicken. Her shoulders were hunched forward, making herself even smaller, and every few seconds her eyes would flick up to check the faces around the table. The conversation flowed around me in predictable patterns. Vanessa dominated, steering every topic back to either Owen's accomplishments or their family's various activities and commitments. Porter provided supportive murmurs and nervous laughter. Owen basked in the attention, and Ayla remained invisible. When the food arrived, I watched Vanessa correct Ayla's posture twice and remind her to use her napkin. Small things, the kind of corrections that might seem reasonable to an outside observer, but I noticed how Ayla's jaw tightened each time, how her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her fork grip. "Ayla, elbows off the table," Vanessa said sweetly, and Owen smirked. "Yeah, Ayla, didn't your mom teach you any manners?" Owen added, and this time Porter didn't even make his mild protest. Ayla's face went pale, and she pressed her lips together in a thin line. Her mother, my daughter-in-law Talia, had passed away 4 years ago in a car accident. It was the kind of comment designed to cut deep while maintaining plausible deniability. Just kids being kids, right? I was about to speak when Ayla's hand moved across the table. Quick and subtle, she slid something toward me while the adults were laughing at one of Vanessa's stories about her book club. A fortune cookie, still in its plastic wrapper. "I'm full," she said quietly. "Grandpa can have mine." I picked up the cookie, cracked it open, and unfolded the small slip of paper inside. The words were written in careful, 9-year-old handwriting. "Grandpa, please take me. Don't say anything to my parents." I kept my face neutral, even managed a small chuckle as if I'd read something amusing. But inside, everything went cold. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my shirt pocket, maintaining the same easy smile I'd been wearing all evening. "Good fortune?" Vanessa asked, raising an eyebrow. "Something about patience being rewarded," I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of forced conversation and careful observation. I watched how Ayla flinched when Vanessa reached across her for the soy sauce. I noticed how she asked permission before speaking, how she monitored every adult face for signs of disapproval. I saw how Owen deliberately knocked over her water glass, and how Vanessa's sharp look blamed Ayla for the accident. When the check came, I reached for my wallet, but Vanessa waved me off with theatrical generosity. "Please, Hayes. Porter's got this. We're doing just fine." Outside in the parking lot, Vanessa insisted on a group photo. "For social media," she explained, positioning everyone just so. Owen stood in the center, grinning. Porter and Vanessa flanked him, looking like the perfect blended family. I was placed at the edge, and Ayla was squeezed in beside me. As Vanessa fiddled with her phone's camera settings, Ayla's small hand found my sleeve. Her fingers gripped the fabric with desperate intensity, and when I looked down, her eyes were wide and pleading. "Everyone say cheese," Vanessa called out. We smiled, the camera flashed, and as we broke apart, my phone buzzed with a calendar reminder I'd forgotten about. "Ayla pickup authorization update, tomorrow 9 a.m. I frowned at the notification. I hadn't scheduled any pickup authorization update. In fact, I hadn't even known such a thing existed. But as I watched Vanessa efficiently herd everyone toward their car, making sure Ayla got in first and Owen controlled the window seat, I began to understand that someone had been very busy making decisions about my access to my granddaughter. Porter gave me a quick, awkward hug goodbye. "Thanks for dinner, Dad. We should do this more often." "Absolutely," Vanessa agreed, her smile bright and empty. "Maybe next month when our schedule calms down." I watched their taillights disappear into traffic, then sat in my truck for a long time, staring at that folded piece of paper. A 9-year-old doesn't write a note like that on impulse. This was planned, thought through, probably carried around for days waiting for the right moment. "Don't say anything to my parents." She knew exactly what would happen if I did. The house I'd given Porter sat in one of those newer subdivisions where every lawn looked like a golf course and every mailbox was regulation height. I'd bought it for him and Talia right after Ayla was born, back when I still thought money could solve the distance that had grown between us over the years. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where they could build something stable. Talia had loved that house. She'd spent hours planning the garden, painting Ayla's nursery a soft yellow that caught the morning light. After the accident, Porter had rattled around in it like a ghost, unable to cope with the memories, but unwilling to leave them behind. Enter Vanessa. They'd met at a grief counseling group, though she'd been there for her divorce, not a loss like his. She was everything Talia hadn't been: polished, organized, decisive. Where Talia had been gentle and thoughtful, Vanessa was efficient and commanding. Within 6 months of meeting Porter, she'd moved in with her teenage son. Within a year, they were married. The transformation was swift and thorough. Talia's garden was replaced with low-maintenance landscaping. The family photos were edited down to a select few, mostly featuring the new blended family. Ayla's toys were consolidated and organized, her schedule structured and supervised. "It's good for her," Porter had explained during one of our increasingly rare conversations. "Vanessa knows about child development. She's got experience with Owen." What Vanessa had was control, and she wielded it with the kind of subtle precision that made you question your own perceptions. The changes were always reasonable, always framed as improvements. Who could argue with better organization, clearer boundaries, higher expectations? I'd started noticing the small things during my visits. How Ayla asked permission before getting a drink of water. How she apologized for laughing too loudly. How she'd developed a habit of scanning adult faces constantly, reading moods, and adjusting her behavior accordingly. "She's just going through an adjustment phase," Vanessa would explain when I mentioned Ayla's increasing quietness. Blended families require patience and consistency. The weekend visits I'd enjoyed with Ayla began to face obstacles: schedule conflicts, family commitments, important events that couldn't be moved. When I did see her, it was usually in group settings where our conversations were monitored and guided. "We don't want to confuse her with too many different rules and expectations," Vanessa had said, her tone reasonable and concerned. "Children thrive on consistency." Porter nodded along, grateful to have someone else making the difficult decisions. He'd been overwhelmed by single parenthood, terrified of making the wrong choice. Vanessa's confidence was a relief, her certainty a comfort. But I remembered the little girl who used to spend entire Saturdays with me at the hardware store, asking questions about every tool and helping me organize screws by size. I remembered how she'd fall asleep in my truck on the way home from our adventures, completely trusting and content. That little girl was disappearing, replaced by someone careful and anxious, always watching for the next correction or criticism. Back in my small apartment, I sat at my kitchen table and carefully unfolded the fortune cookie message. The handwriting was shaky but determined, each letter formed with the kind of concentration that comes from knowing you only get one chance. "Grandpa, please take me. Don't say anything to my parents." I found a notebook and started writing down everything I could remember from the evening: the seating arrangement, the corrections, Owen's casual cruelty, Ayla's body language, the grip on my sleeve during the photo. Then I went further back, documenting the pattern of canceled visits, the increasing restrictions on my time with Ayla, the gradual erosion of my place in her life. What I saw on paper was a systematic campaign to isolate a child from her support system, executed with just enough plausible deniability to avoid suspicion. My phone rang around 10 o'clock. Porter's name appeared on the screen. "Hey, Dad, good dinner tonight." "It was nice to see everyone," I said carefully. "Listen, Vanessa and I have been talking, and we think maybe we need to be more structured about visits. You know, plan them out better so they don't interfere with Ayla's activities and homework." "I see. It's nothing personal. We just want what's best for her. Maybe if you could coordinate through Vanessa, she's got a better handle on the schedule." I stared at the fortune cookie message on my table. "Porter, how does Ayla seem to you these days?" "What do you mean?" "Happy, settled, like herself." There was a pause. "She's adjusting. It takes time. Vanessa says we need to be patient but firm." "And what do you say?" Another pause, longer this time. "I say I trust my wife to know what she's doing. She's got experience with this stuff, Dad. More than I do." After he hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about the house I'd given them. The deed transfer had been structured through my attorney, with certain provisions that Porter had never bothered to read carefully. At the time, I'd thought of them as simple protections, ways to ensure the house stayed in the family, that it would be there for Ayla's future. I'd never imagined I might need to use them. Lincoln Elementary School looked like every other suburban school built in the last 20 years: red brick, cheerful signage, and a front office designed to filter access with polite efficiency. I arrived at pickup time, joining the line of cars and SUVs that snaked around the building. When I reached the front of the line, the crossing guard, a pleasant woman in her 50s, leaned down to my truck window with a puzzled expression. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't see you on our pickup list for today." "Pickup list?" "For Ayla Solmer. You're Hayes Solmer, right? I recognize you from previous pickups, but you're not authorized for today." I kept my voice level and friendly. "I'm her grandfather. I've picked her up before." "I understand, and I'm sorry for the confusion, but we have to follow the list we're given by the parents. You'll need to contact them to get added for future pickups. Through the school's glass doors, I could see Ayla sitting in the lobby with her backpack, waiting. She spotted my truck and her face lit up for just a moment before confusion took over. I gave her a small wave and a reassuring smile, then pulled out of line. Instead of leaving, I parked and walked into the main office. The receptionist, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, looked up from her computer. "Can I help you?" "I'm Hayes Solmer, Ayla's grandfather. There seems to be some confusion about pickup authorization." "Oh yes, let me check." She clicked through several screens. "It looks like your authorization was removed last week. The request came from..." She squinted at the screen. "Vanessa Solmer. She's listed as the primary contact." "I see. What's the process for getting back on the list?" "You'd need written permission from both parents or from whoever has primary custody. It's a safety policy." I thanked her and asked to speak with the school counselor, if one was available. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from Denise Harper, a woman in her early 40s, with the kind of calm competence that comes from years of navigating family dynamics. "Mr. Solmer, what can I do for you?" "I'm concerned about my granddaughter. There seem to be some changes in her home situation that I'm not sure are in her best interests." Denise leaned back in her chair, her expression neutral but attentive. "What kind of changes?" I chose my words carefully, sticking to observable facts. "She's become very quiet, very careful. She seems anxious about making mistakes. I've also noticed that my access to her has been restricted without explanation." "Have you spoken with her parents about these concerns?" "I've tried. My son defers to his wife, and his wife believes I'm overstepping boundaries." Denise made a note on her pad. "How long have you been noticing these changes?" "Gradually, over the past year, but they've become more pronounced recently." "Mr. Solmer, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. While I can't discuss specific details about Ayla without parental consent, I can tell you that we take all concerns about student welfare seriously. If there are signs of distress or significant behavioral changes, we document them. And if those signs exist, then we follow appropriate protocols. Sometimes that means family conferences. Sometimes it means involving outside resources." I left the school with more questions than answers, but also with the sense that I wasn't the only one who had noticed changes in Ayla. Denise Harper struck me as someone who paid attention, who understood the difference between normal childhood adjustment and something more concerning. At work, I found Trevor loading pallets in the yard behind our warehouse. We'd been friends for 15 years, ever since I'd transitioned from long-haul trucking to local delivery. He was one of the few people who knew the full story of my family situation. "You look like hell," he said by way of greeting. "Family dinner last night." "Ah, how's the little one?" I pulled out the fortune cookie message and showed it to him. Trevor read it twice, his expression growing grim. "Jesus, Hayes, what are you going to do?" "I don't know yet, but I'm not going to storm in there making accusations. That's exactly what they'd expect from the simple truck driver who doesn't understand complex family dynamics." "So what's the alternative?" "I learn the system. I follow the rules. I let them think I'm backing down while I figure out the right way to help her." Trevor handed the message back to me. "You know I'm here if you need anything. Backup, childcare, whatever." That afternoon, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Grant Whitaker, a family law attorney whose name I'd gotten from the employee assistance program at work. The second was to my own attorney, the one who'd handled the house transfer to Porter. Both conversations were brief and factual. I wasn't ready to make any moves yet, but I needed to understand my options. What rights did a grandfather have? What constituted evidence of a problem? What were the proper channels for addressing concerns about a child's welfare? The answers were complex, but the message was clear. Emotion and accusation wouldn't get me anywhere. Documentation and proper procedure were the only tools that mattered. That evening, I sat in my apartment and began preparing. I organized my space, cleared out the spare bedroom that had been serving as storage, and researched school districts and childcare options. I wasn't sure what was coming, but I wanted to be ready. On my nightstand, I kept the fortune cookie message in a small frame, a reminder that somewhere in that controlled, efficient household, a 9-year-old girl was waiting for someone to hear her silent cry for help. The coffee shop on 5th Street was the kind of place where conversations disappeared into the ambient noise of espresso machines and casual chatter. Grant Whitaker sat across from me in a corner booth, a legal pad and tablet arranged neatly beside his coffee cup. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of careful attention to detail that inspired confidence. "Tell me about your relationship with your granddaughter," he said, pen poised over his notepad. I walked him through the history, the close bond Ayla and I had shared, the gradual restrictions that had been imposed, the changes in her behavior and demeanor. I showed him the fortune cookie message, explaining the context and my observations from the dinner. Grant studied the note carefully. "This is compelling, but on its own, it's not enough. Family courts are reluctant to disrupt existing custody arrangements without clear evidence of harm or neglect." What constitutes clear evidence? Documented patterns of behavior, professional observations from teachers, counselors, or medical personnel, evidence of the child's living conditions and emotional state, proof that you can provide a stable, safe alternative. And if I can gather that evidence, then we explore options. Emergency custody in extreme cases, but more likely a formal petition for visitation rights, or, if the situation warrants it, a custody modification. I left the meeting with a clear understanding of what needed to be done. This wasn't about emotion or family drama. It was about building a legal case that could withstand scrutiny. 2 days later, Vanessa called a family meeting. "I think we need to clear the air," she announced when I arrived at the community center she'd chosen as neutral ground. "There seems to be some confusion about boundaries and expectations." Porter sat beside her, looking uncomfortable but supportive. Owen sprawled in his chair with the casual arrogance of a teenager who knew he was favored. Ayla sat very straight, very still, her hands folded in her lap. "Hayes, I want you to know that we appreciate your love for Ayla," Vanessa began, her tone warm and reasonable. "But we're concerned that some of your recent behavior might be confusing for her." "What behavior is that?" "The unexpected school visits, the questions about our family routines. Ayla mentioned that you seemed upset at dinner the other night." I looked at Ayla, who was staring at the table. "I wasn't upset. I was observing." "Observing what?" "How my granddaughter interacts with her family, whether she feels safe and supported." Vanessa's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course she feels safe. She's surrounded by people who love her and want what's best for her." "I'm sure that's true. I just want to make sure I understand my role in that support system." "Your role is to be a loving grandfather who respects the decisions Porter and I make as her parents," Vanessa said, her voice still pleasant but carrying an edge now. "That means coordinating visits through me, following our house rules when you're with her, and trusting us to know what's best for our family." Owen snorted. Maybe Grandpa's just getting old and confused. "Owen," Porter said mildly, but again, there was no real correction. I kept my voice level. "I think there might be some misunderstanding about what I want. I love Ayla, and I want to be part of her life. I'm willing to work within whatever framework you think is best." Vanessa relaxed slightly, sensing victory. "I'm glad to hear that. I think if we all communicate better and respect each other's roles, we can make this work." We spent another 20 minutes establishing guidelines for my future involvement. All visits to be scheduled through Vanessa, no unplanned school pickups, no undermining of household rules or decisions. I agreed to everything with the kind of quiet compliance that seemed to satisfy her need for control. As we walked to our cars afterward, Ayla managed to fall into step beside me for a few moments. "Are you mad at me, Grandpa?" she whispered. "Never," I said quietly. "I could never be mad at you. I didn't mean to get you in trouble." "You didn't get me in trouble, sweetheart. You did exactly the right thing." Vanessa's voice cut through our conversation. "Ayla, come help me with the car door." And just like that, the moment was over. That weekend, I began documenting everything in earnest. I created a timeline of visits, noting dates, durations, and any restrictions or conditions imposed. I documented conversations with school personnel and my observations of Ayla's behavior. I researched child development and emotional indicators of distress. Most importantly, I began preparing my apartment for the possibility that Ayla might need to stay with me. I bought a proper bed for the spare room, stocked the refrigerator with food she liked, and researched the enrollment process for the local elementary school. Trevor helped me move furniture and offered to serve as a character reference if needed. "That little girl's lucky to have you fighting for her," he said as we assembled the bed frame. "I'm not fighting yet," I replied. "I'm just getting ready." On Sunday evening, my phone buzzed with a calendar notification I hadn't set. School Concern Conference, Tuesday 2, now p.m. I stared at the notification, puzzled. I hadn't scheduled any conference, and I certainly hadn't been invited to one. But something about the timing and phrasing made me think this wasn't a mistake. Someone else was building a case too. The school conference room felt smaller with 5 adults crowded around the circular table. Denise Harper sat with a thick folder in front of her, flanked by Ayla's teacher, Mrs. Harlex, and the school principal, Dr. Thallon. Across from them, Vanessa had positioned herself between Porter and me, her posture radiating controlled tension. "Thank you all for coming," Denise began. "We've called this meeting to discuss some concerns about Ayla's adjustment and well-being." Vanessa leaned forward slightly. "I'm not sure what concerns you're referring to. Ayla is doing fine academically, and we've been working hard to provide structure and consistency at home." Mrs. Harlex opened her own folder. "Ayla's academic performance isn't the issue. It's her social and emotional presentation that has us concerned." "In what way?" Porter asked, speaking for the first time. "She's become increasingly withdrawn over the past several months," Mrs. Harlex explained. "She rarely participates in class discussions, even when she clearly knows the answers. She apologizes excessively for minor things. During lunch and recess, she tends to isolate herself." Denise added, "We've also noticed that she seems unusually anxious about making mistakes or drawing attention to herself. When she does speak up, she often looks around to gauge adult reactions before continuing." "Children go through phases," Vanessa said, her voice taking on a slightly defensive edge. "We're dealing with a blended family situation. Some adjustment is normal." "Absolutely," Dr. Thallon agreed. "Which is why we wanted to bring everyone together to discuss how we can best support her through this transition." I had remained silent through the first part of the meeting, but now I spoke up. "How long have you been observing these behaviors?" Denise consulted her notes. "The changes became noticeable around the beginning of the school year, but they've intensified over the past month." "Have you observed any specific triggers or patterns?" "She seems particularly anxious on Mondays after weekends at home. She's also very sensitive to any form of correction or criticism, even when it's delivered gently." Vanessa's smile had grown strained. "I think you might be overanalyzing normal childhood behavior. Ayla is a sensitive child, but she's well cared for and loved." "No one is questioning that," Denise said diplomatically. "We're simply trying to understand how to help her feel more comfortable and confident at school." The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, with various suggestions for classroom accommodations and home strategies. Throughout it all, I noticed how Vanessa deflected concerns, reframed problems as normal phases, and subtly positioned herself as the expert on Ayla's needs. As we prepared to leave, Dr. Thalen mentioned that the school would be implementing a check-in system with Denise to monitor Ayla's progress. We want to make sure she has all the support she needs, she explained. In the parking lot, Vanessa's composure finally cracked slightly. I don't appreciate having our parenting questioned by people who see Ayla for 6 hours a day, she said to Porter, though her voice was loud enough for me to hear. They're just trying to help, Porter replied, but his voice lacked conviction. They're creating problems where none exist, and your father sitting there taking notes like he's building some kind of case. I looked up from my phone, where I had indeed been making notes. I want to understand how to help her too. The way to help her is to stop undermining the stability we've worked so hard to create. That evening, I visited the County Family Services office, not to file any complaints or make any accusations, but simply to understand the resources available and the proper procedures for addressing concerns about a child's welfare. The intake counselor, a patient woman named Maria Santos, explained the various options for reporting concerns, the investigation process, and the criteria used to determine when intervention might be necessary. What happens if a child explicitly asks for help? I asked. That depends on the nature of the request and the evidence supporting it. A child's expressed wishes are certainly taken into consideration, especially as they get older. And what about family members who have concerns? They can file reports, provide documentation, and request investigations. But the system is designed to keep families together whenever possible. We look for ways to provide support and resources before we consider removal. I left with a stack of informational brochures and a clear understanding of the process. More importantly, I left with the knowledge that if the situation escalated, there were proper channels to follow. Back at my apartment, I found a message on my answering machine from Grant Whitaker. Hayes, I've been thinking about our conversation. Given what you've described, you might want to consider filing for formal visitation rights. It would establish your legal standing and create a record of your concerns. Call me when you have a chance to discuss. I also found an envelope that had been slipped under my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a child's drawing, a stick figure labeled Grandpa, holding hands with a smaller figure labeled Me. At the bottom, in careful printing, I miss our Saturdays. The drawing was unsigned, but I recognized the handwriting from the fortune cookie message. As I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Courthouse, Thursday, 10th a.m. Bring documentation. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to understand who might have sent it and why. But as I thought about the school meeting, the family services visit, and the growing pattern of documentation I'd been building, I began to suspect that I wasn't the only one who had been preparing for what was coming. Someone else had been watching, waiting, and gathering evidence, and they were ready to act. The courthouse hallway buzzed with the quiet efficiency of legal proceedings in motion. I arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a manila folder containing months of documentation. School observations, meeting notes, visit logs, and photographs of my prepared living space. Grant Whitaker met me near the elevators, his expression serious but confident. Are you ready for this? He asked. I've been ready since the night she handed me that fortune cookie. Down the hall, I spotted Vanessa emerging from the women's restroom, dressed in a sharp business suit that screamed competence and respectability. She moved with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she'd prepared for battle. Porter trailed behind her, looking lost and overwhelmed. Mr. Sulmer? A woman's voice called from behind me. I turned to see Denise Harper approaching with Dr. Thalen and Mrs. Harlex. We received subpoenas to testify today. Grant nodded. The court wanted to hear from the school personnel who've been observing Ayla's behavior. Vanessa spotted our group, and her expression hardened. She whispered something sharp to Porter, who nodded reluctantly and approached me. Dad, what's this all about? Vanessa says you're trying to take Ayla away from us. I'm trying to make sure she's safe and heard, I replied. That's all I've ever wanted. But why the lawyers? Why the court? We could have worked this out as a family. I looked at my son, really looked at him. He'd lost weight since Talia passed away, and there were new lines around his eyes. He looked like a man who'd been making compromises for so long that he'd forgotten what his own voice sounded like. Porter, when was the last time you had a conversation with Ayla? Just the two of you, without anyone else managing it? He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. The silence stretched between us until Vanessa appeared at his elbow. "The hearing is starting," she announced, her voice crisp and controlled. Inside the courtroom, Judge Patricia Reeves presided with the kind of calm authority that comes from years of untangling family disputes. She was a woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. "This is a hearing regarding emergency temporary guardianship and custody modification for Ayla Solmer," she began. "Mr. Whitaker, you may present your case." Grant stood and laid out the situation with methodical precision. He presented the fortune cookie message as evidence of a child's cry for help, supported by school observations of behavioral changes, documented restrictions on my access to Ayla, and evidence of my ability to provide stable care. Denise Harper testified about Ayla's increasing withdrawal and anxiety, her reluctance to speak up in class, and her apparent fear of making mistakes. Mrs. Harlex corroborated these observations and added details about Ayla's isolation during social activities. "In your professional opinion," Grant asked Denise, "do these behavioral changes suggest a child in distress?" "Yes," Denise replied without hesitation. "The pattern is consistent with a child who feels unsafe expressing herself or making normal childhood mistakes." Vanessa's attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Tate Richardson, cross-examined aggressively. "Isn't it true that blended families often experience adjustment periods? That children may act out or withdraw as they adapt to new family structures?" "That's certainly possible," Denise acknowledged. "But the duration and intensity of these changes, combined with the child's explicit request for help, suggests something beyond normal adjustment." When it came time for Vanessa to testify, she presented herself as a devoted stepmother dealing with a difficult transition. She spoke about providing structure, setting appropriate boundaries, and protecting Ayla from confusion and conflicting messages. "Mr. Solmer has been undermining our authority," she stated firmly. "He questions our decisions, makes Ayla feel like she has to choose sides, and refuses to respect the boundaries we've established for our family's well-being." But under cross-examination, cracks began to show in her polished presentation. "Mrs. Hart Solmer, why did you remove Mr. Solmer from the school pickup authorization list without discussing it with him first?" "I felt it was necessary to maintain consistency in Ayla's routine." "Whose decision was it to restrict his visits to group settings only?" "It was a mutual decision based on what we felt was best for everyone involved." "Did you consult with Ayla about these decisions?" "Ayla is 9 years old. She's not equipped to make these kinds of judgments." Grant then presented evidence that Vanessa had been systematically isolating Ayla from outside support systems, canceling counseling appointments that had been helping her process her mother's passing, restricting contact with Talia's family, and monitoring all communications with me. The turning point came when Judge Reeves asked to speak with Ayla privately in her chambers. The little girl who emerged 20 minutes later looked smaller somehow, but also relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. When court reconvened, Judge Reeves delivered her decision with measured authority. "Based on the evidence presented and my conversation with the child, I find that Ayla's current living situation, while not abusive, has become restrictive to the point of being emotionally harmful. The child has clearly expressed a desire for alternative placement, and Mr. Solmer has demonstrated both the capability and commitment to provide appropriate care. She granted me immediate temporary guardianship, with provisions for supervised visitation between Ayla and Porter, and ordered family counseling for all parties. But Judge Reeves wasn't finished. There is one additional matter the court must address, she continued, consulting a separate file. It has come to the court's attention that the residence currently occupied by Mr. Porter Solmer was transferred to him under specific conditions that may have been violated. Vanessa's face went pale. Porter looked confused. Grant stood again. Your Honor, the original deed transfer included provisions requiring that the property be used for the benefit and welfare of Mr. Solmer's biological descendants. Given the court's findings regarding Ayla's welfare, we believe those conditions have not been met. I watched the realization dawn on Porter's face. The house, the foundation of his new life with Vanessa, had never been his free and clear. The legal language he'd skimmed over during the transfer had included safeguards I'd hoped never to use. Judge Reeves ordered an immediate review of the property transfer, with temporary restrictions on any major decisions regarding the resident's pending resolution. As the courtroom emptied, Vanessa stood frozen in the hallway, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Owen, who had been waiting outside, looked between his mother and the legal documents with growing understanding. "Mom, are we going to lose the house?" he asked, his teenage bravado finally cracking. Porter approached me one last time, his face a mixture of anger and devastation. "Dad, how could you do this? That house, it was supposed to be our fresh start." "It was supposed to be Ayla's home," I replied quietly. "A place where she felt safe and loved. When it stopped being that, the conditions were no longer met." 2 hours later, I stood on the courthouse steps with Ayla beside me, her small hand tucked securely in mine. She carried a single backpack containing her most important possessions: a few books, some clothes, and a framed photo of her mother. In the distance, I could see a moving truck parked outside the house I'd given to my son, the house that had become a symbol of control rather than love. Vanessa was directing the loading with sharp, efficient gestures, while Porter sat on the front steps looking like a man who'd finally understood the price of letting others make all his decisions. "Grandpa?" Ayla's voice was soft but clear. "Are we really going home now?" I looked down at my granddaughter, this brave, resilient little girl who had found the courage to ask for help when the adults around her had failed to see her pain. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going home." As we walked toward my truck, Ayla's grip on my hand tightened with something that felt like hope. Behind us, the courthouse doors swung shut on one chapter of our story, while ahead of us lay the possibility of writing a better one. The fortune cookie had delivered its promise. Patience had been rewarded. And sometimes, the quiet competence of an old truck driver was exactly what the system needed to work the way it was supposed to.